So every episode of Brain Nevat starts with asking our guests to start with a thought experiment. And the idea is that your imagination is captured by some fantastical thing. But I'm going to ask Yolandi to start with a real life case.
Okay, thank you. So this is going to be a bit interactive. By a show of hands, I would like to know who of you think that this was made by a human? Okay, human or animal? Human? Okay. We can have a few examples. Human or animal? Human? Animal? The rest? Right. Human or animal? Human? Animal? Okay. Do you guys want me to tell you whether you were right or wrong? Okay, I'll go backwards now. Human? Human and animal? Human? Animal? Animal? Human? Human? Animal? 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 Human? Animal? 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 Human? Animal. So I think what that does is it shows us that it's not entirely obvious when art's been made by an animal.
So I want you to go to the painting of the elephant because everyone gasped at that, yeah? Okay, so that's drawn by an elephant. Yeah. So Yolandi has an image of the elephant drawing that. So the question we're asking today is, can animals create art? So just as a show of hands, now that you've seen that that was created by an elephant and that was not the expectation, are you convinced? No. Okay. Yes, most of you are, but some not. Okay, so personally, I'm not convinced. So one of the questions I'd want to ask is, what makes a piece of art? So what makes art art? And is the elephant doing the things required to make art art? And one of the questions we ask is, does the elephant have the right intentions? Does art require intentionality on the part of the artist? Does the artist need to intend to create art? And does the elephant have the right intentions?
Well, that's a very good question, and I don't know, right? But by the same token, I don't know if artists have intention to create art. I wouldn't know because you don't know other minds, right? Knowing other minds is incredibly difficult. And so this question kind of intersects with a few things. So the first is it intersects with this idea of what art is, what makes something art. If we look around the room, if we found any of these objects outside on the side of the road, we would probably just think it's, there's a box there. We'd think someone just threw out a box. But the fact that it's here might entail that it's an artwork. But that means we kind of define it by an institutional definition, right? Art is art if it gets called art and if it's sold as art. But that then gives us the idea of what happens if you have an artist that never exhibits or never sold a painting. Are they not artists? And we know a lot of very good artists that never sold paintings, at least not while they were alive, right? And so in a case like this, it becomes very difficult because do we know the animal mind? Do we know what that animal is thinking? And it brings up an ethical question. Was that animal perhaps coerced into making that artwork? Were they hit every time they made a wrong mark? And I don't know. It seems from what I could tell from the literature that they've been taught how to do it, but it is still willful. They don't seem to be forced to do it. But again, who knows, right?
So I want to follow up on Jason's question about intentionality. Mm-hmm. It seems that there are certain objects in the world that we recognize as very beautiful. So if you're hiking and you see a beautiful mountain and the trees around you, you say, those are gorgeous objects, but you don't think any of it's art. Imagine you're hiking on a volcano on a little island and you see a guy who's set up a little shop on the volcano and he's a sculptor. And he says, I take the volcanic rock and I make sculptures of people dancing. You say, that's a work of art. You've used the natural object and you've made a sculpture of people dancing. Then you keep going and you see what you assume is one of the sculpture's objects of people dancing. And you tell him about it. You say, I see you left one of those up the path. And he says, that's not one of mine. that formed naturally by the volcano. So now you've got these indistinguishable objects. They both look like people dancing. And I think we can both recognize that they're beautiful, but think that the one is art and the one is not. And what's interesting about what you've done is you've said, here's a range of objects that it's indistinguishable. You've got some abstract expressionism made by human beings, and you've got some things that look like abstract expressionism made by animals. And the question is, do we just have objects that look like art, or are they actually art? And then I think about other kinds of beings who make things that are either art or look like art. So if you think about artificial intelligence, you can, on your phone right now, ask your AI to make you a work of art. Okay? And it might be indistinguishable from some of the work that you'll see around here. So you can describe in some detail, a photograph in a room with certain kind of lighting, or of an installation that involves a lion and a chain, and it could produce something indistinguishable. We don't know if the machine has the intent needed to make the art. So do you think the intent matters? We might not know whether the artist has the intent or whether the machine has it or whether the animal does. Do we want to bake it into the definition that there's a difference between things that resemble art and things that are actually art?
So I think that's a really good question, and makes me think of Marcel Duchamp's fountain, which was in effect a urinal, right, that he took from somewhere, I'm not sure where, and he just put it on a plinth and in a white cube and called it art, and that became art. Where I doubt any of the men here and women, maybe if that's your jive, would go into a bathroom and say, oh, this is clearly like I'm peeing into an artwork, right? We have this intuition that there's something that distinguishes that urinal from that other urinal that we use every day. And so I think the conceptual art movement, as I understand it, has really pushed the boundaries of what makes art. So I think for very long, beauty was a big element of art. And I think that that's sort of fallen away, right? We don't necessarily think art has to be beautiful to be considered art. But at the same time, calling something like a urinal art, I think a lot of people would have intuitively a problem accepting that. If you're in the art world, you might go, no, that's clearly, it's Marcel Duchamp, we know it's a very famous artwork, it's, it's clearly art. But I think if you go to Joe Soap and just who's never heard of the fountain, and you show him Marcel Duchamp's fountain, they might have trouble for it. So that brings into kind of, is it the artist's intention that makes it art, or is it someone else appreciating it as art that makes it art? And so I would imagine there has to be some intention, but I can have all the intention in the world of being an artist, and I can even create things in the privacy of my home. Can I call myself an artist until I've sold a painting or sold a sculpture or until I've exhibited? And it seems like there needs to at least be some sort of recognition or self-proclamation in order for it to be considered art.
There are difficult cases, though. So if you think that what art is it's a combination of the intention of the artist plus the institution recognizing it as art, you might think, okay, so that's what art is. But then there's some difficult cases. So I'll tell you a story. A few years ago, I had a friend. He came into a lot of money, and he decided that he would populate his house with these beautiful paintings. And these paintings were worth a lot of money. He kept going on about how much money these paintings were worth. And he took us around his home, which had been newly renovated. And the creme de la creme, the finale of the tour was this painting above his bed. And it was a white canvas with a black line that just sort of had been wisped through this canvas. And I said to him, is this art? And he was very upset. He said, oh, it cost 500,000 Rand. And he showed me the provenance of this. It had a book with the provenance of where this came from and everyone that had owned it and the story of the artist. And I said, but I think this fails the Labrador test. So the Labrador test is a test I came up with which said, could my Labrador create this piece of art? If I stuck a paintbrush in my Labrador's mouth, could she create this wisp across the canvas? And I think she could. It fails the Labrador test. Now, what's interesting is what I thought at the time was if something fails the Labrador test, in other words, a Labrador could create it, that means that if a human created it, it's not art. But now we're looking at things the other way around. So we're saying, Well, actually, there's a whole lot of pieces of art that look exactly the same, whether they're made by humans or animals, and that means the Labrador can create art, not that the human who creates art that looks like the Labrador's art isn't creating art. So the question is, if humans and animals can create art that looks very similar, it's recognized by the institution as art, perhaps. So some of these paintings were sold.
Oh, yeah, for huge amounts of money.
Yeah, some of these paintings created by animals were sold for a lot of money. So it seems like it's passing the institutional test. It looks like it's passing the intentionality test. It looks like the elephant is intending to create that elephant shape on the paper. But I still want to say there's certain cases where you've got both of those elements, but it's not art. I would want to say that wisp across the paper is not art, even though the artist intends it to be art, even though it's sold for a lot of money.
But does that not bring up the question of whether it's good art or bad art, right? So it might be that it's art. It might just be, in your view, bad art. But that becomes really difficult because is it really that subjective? Can I look at something and just say, well, it's ugly, so, or it doesn't appeal to me, so I don't think it's good art, when in fact the entire institution recognizes it as really good art. So is it the fact that you need people who are experts in the field to judge it as art, and Jason is not an expert in the field, so maybe your opinion on it doesn't really matter? Or is it really just the fact that, well, someone bought it, and the fact that someone bought it and didn't buy another piece of artwork makes that thing more valuable or more viewed as art? But also going back to this idea of like, can an animal make it and can an animal not? We've so far just been speaking about visual art, but I think there's other interesting examples as well coming from the animal kingdom, right? So you can think about architecture. How much of human architecture is based on animal architecture? And even some of these that I showed that are the bowerbirds. So these are bowerbirds, right? And it's not a nest. They don't nest in there. They create these bowers and they find these objects around, and they kind of create it in a very specific way. And if you go and you move one of those things, they will move it back, right, in the same place. So there seems to be a kind of intentionality there, but that is for sexual selection, right? They're not creating that. They're basically creating that to get laid, right? And so maybe that's what artists do as well. I don't know. I'm not an artist. I'm married to one, so it clearly works on me, right? But something like this there's this sort of architectural element. What's really interesting about bowerbirds as well, they use perspective, so they'll place certain objects further back or further to the front to create like depth and depth perception. And so this is kind of rudimentary architecture. This was also by a bowerbird, and they choose how to create that. And you can see they're all different. So something like this could be more sculptural, but even something like music, right? So think about something like, many birds just have sort of very standard sounds, but you do get birds that can mimic a lot of sounds, but not just mimicking sounds. They can compose. They can learn different sounds and put those sounds together in different ways. And is that not a kind of composition, right? So I think even if we start to think even wider about what art is and different kinds of arts, it becomes even more complex. Is it just, you were saying a printer, it's a very advanced printer, it's just copying what it sees out there, or is there something more to it?
So I'm really glad you drew this distinction between what makes something art and what makes something good. And so you could imagine adopting a very generous definition of art. So if you think it's art, it's art. And we've now boxed that question aside, and then we go, okay, fine, it's work of art, but it's terrible. Like, I would never put that in my house. It shows no level of dexterity, of skill. I feel nothing when I see it. So when we're trying to evaluate whether it's good, what are the things we should take into account? So you could think that the difficulty of making it matters. I remember going to a show a long time ago where someone had quite painstakingly cut into 4 different layers of paper, so to create a interesting pattern defect, and it was going that took hundreds of hours. And then he had laser cut versions of it next to it, which you could buy quite cheaply, which looked identical. So on the one hand, you say, do I care about the appearance of the object? Do I care how much you labored? That labor theory of value, we think in the ordinary marketplace, is irrelevant. How much time you spend toiling away, the thing doesn't set its price. So why should it tell us how good the work is? then you might think that, is it about how much pleasure it brings people? So if we think, if you're in the cinema, what does the best? Well, it's the superhero movies, right? We often think they're bad art. So they're clearly the ones that bring in the most pleasure. People love watching them. But the ones that linger might be the ones that have small audiences and are the better works of art. So do you have an idea of how you determine what's good and what's bad?
I think that is an incredibly difficult question when we think about art, and especially when we think about animal art. I don't know if this is a good or a bad bower. I don't know. I don't have an objective measure of what makes this good. But what's really interesting is with the bowerbird specifically, so they will create it. Obviously, the females will come and have a look at these bowers, and they will mate with whichever one they think was the nicest. But the male birds will also come and look. Right, so the male birds, and especially young male birds, will come and also have a look at all the different bowers, which that's not for sexual selection. I mean, that's not, at least not in a bird sense of the word. That is just simply, they seem to be appreciating the artwork, right? So by that kind of definition, I don't know, if a bowerbird spends more time looking at this one than the other one, maybe it's a good artwork. So, but there has to be some sort of what's good for you might not be good for me. So there is a kind of relativity when we think about art. I mean, artworks have brought me to pieces that might, I've been crying over artworks that might leave you stone cold. You don't have any emotional reaction to it. But I would be worried about going too far down that line, that if we go to complete relativism, where we just say, well, I declare this art now, right? We're in a gallery, here's a glass of wine, this is art. Pay me 10,000 Rand for this, right? That seems also a bit silly, right? So where's that line between simply just declaring something, having some sort of intention, having the recognition for it? But even if we just rely on recognition and institutional recognition, that can take us down a very slippery slope of, for example, it might be that people are phenomenal artists, but they don't have a parent in the art industry who can get them in. And so we might have created amazing artists that don't get recognized because they come from a disadvantaged background. And so I'd also be worried about just saying it's just the institution, because the institution is human and humans are fallible, right? So where is that line?
So one of the really important questions that comes up is reading the minds of animals. So philosophers have discussed this since Descartes' time, this problem of solipsism, this problem of knowing other minds, what's in other minds. And we have this problem with people. You don't know whether the person next to you is actually conscious. You don't know whether the wife that you go to bed with is conscious. She might just be an automaton that functions just like a conscious being, but she's not. That seems entirely possible. There's some good novels written about this. There's one called Echopraxia, I think it's Watts, where he describes this child that goes through a brain injury as a child, and then a portion of his brain is replaced. And he lives the rest of his life, and it's stipulated in the novel that he's not conscious. He's not a conscious being. But the whole novel is written from his perspective and how he experiences the world, but not as a conscious being. And the question when it comes to animals is, you describe the bowerbirds coming to watch other bowerbirds creating their nests, examining them, maybe forming certain thoughts and beliefs and viewpoints, or are they just automatons? Are they just non-conscious beings that go about their lives and are pre-programmed in a certain way through natural selection or just through genetic changes in their lineage to perform certain actions? Maybe there's some survival advantage to sitting around and watching other bowerbirds make their nests. I don't know what it is, but maybe there's some survival advantage to that. Maybe during those times, they're not attacked by other animals because they're together in a group. I don't know what it is. There's this problem of solipsism, knowing what's in another being's mind. It's easier to overcome that when it comes to people because someone will communicate in certain ways. They'll use language, and we think to ourselves, I use language to express what's in my mind. The person next to me is using language, so they must be expressing what's in their mind. Now, animals are not using language in the same ways that we are, so it's harder to overcome that leap against solipsism, to know that they have a mind with certain beliefs.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it's still hard with humans, right? It is very difficult to know whether the human sitting next to you, it's in philosophy, we call it the problem of other minds. Like, you'll always have the problem of other minds. It's very difficult to know for sure that I'm not just the only conscious person and that everyone else here is robots. I mean, how do I really, really, really know that? It's impossible, right? But then we rely on things. So a functionist, what you were describing is a functionist theory of mind, right? So it looks like a human, it talks like a human, it acts like a human, so I'm going to assume it's human, and we go there. But what's interesting, and it's interesting that you brought up René Descartes, because René Descartes, for those of you having flashbacks to like high school mathematics, the Cartesian planes, if you remember that's the same dude, right? He was also a philosopher. But he was not just a philosopher, he was also a kind of scientist. And what he would do is he would walk around wherever he was, and he would find stray animals. And he was really interested in just basic biology, what goes on inside, right? And so what he would do is he would cut open these animals while they were still alive, right? And obviously that was quite horrific, and these animals would moan or, complain until they died. And when you read his work, when he describes what he was doing, he says, no, this is just, no, don't worry, like, they're not really in pain. All that you're seeing here is like a clock striking 12, right? It just makes a sound, but there's no pain, we are talking about like the 15th century, so I mean, maybe, we didn't know as much as we know now. But I mean, in the history of Western thought, at least, we have this persistent denial of animals' sentience, and never mind sentience, but also something like sapience or consciousness, right? I'm wary of using words like consciousness, because consciousness is a slippery concept, right? I think that's a linguistic problem, perhaps, because what is consciousness? How do I, we don't actually know what consciousness is. And so unless I can maybe pin consciousness down to certain brain activity, I might not know. But I mean, even the best sciences. So consciousness is maybe not the best word, but what we can start thinking about is something like sentience, right? Does an animal feel pleasure? Does it feel pain? Can I frustrate an animal's desires? Can I satisfy an animal's desires? Descartes would have said no, right? He would have just straightforwardly said, it's a clock striking 12. It's chiming, it's an automaton, it's a machine, it's a mechanistic being, there's no emotions, there's no feelings. But the same thing has been said about people of color, of women, right? So we have to be very careful to just kind of rely on this idea of if it has to be rational by some definition or so on. But I think this issue of the sort of separation of humanity from animals. We have this intuition, or I wouldn't even say it's an intuition. I think a lot of Western history is built on this idea that humans are somehow special. We somehow have this like thing that makes us special. And for very long it was rationality. So if you go back to the ancient Greeks, they would say, Aristotle would say man is a rational animal, and man here in the masculine sense, right? Not in the men are rational animals. And you would say, well, it's rationality that distinguishes us. Then we went along a bit further in history and it became language. Well, language distinguishes us from animals, but we now know that animals also have language. We just can't understand it, but they do have language, right? And then it became that humans are tool users. We can use tools. And then Jane Goodall saw chimpanzees using tools and we realized, oh no, man is not a tool user. And so I think this kind of debate actually reflects that deeper history within Western thought where we are so desperate to be somehow categorically different from animals. And if you read The Origin of Species, Darwin said it's a matter of degree and not category, right? We actually are it's separation of degrees, we're not completely different. And so I think this kind of highlights that really well, because where is that line in the sand?
So I'm glad you brought up the ethical issues regarding animals, and it seems that making art is one of those things that's traditionally separated us, that it requires a level of sophistication to make art. And there's a really cool legal case. So there's a guy who thought, wouldn't it be interesting if I set up a camera where a group of macaw monkeys operate and see what happens? And one of these monkeys took a selfie. And it's an amazing picture. The monkey's smiling, it's sort of got its eyes right, the composition is great, and the image was just a very popular image, and it sold the image. And it then got listed in Wiki Commons, so attached to Wikipedia. And he said, well, you can't do that. It's my image. I have the copyright. And they said, no, you don't. This was made by a monkey. The monkey clicked the image. It is the copyright holder. And because the way the law works, it cannot hold copyright. It's free for anyone to use. And this was then championed by Peter. So Peter said, well, we're going to sue for the right of the animal to have the copyright because it's ultimately the one that made the selfie, right? It stood in front of the camera, it posed its face, it hit click, and you're profiteering off the monkey's labor. And this, went all the way to the sort of Court of Appeals. And Peter's interested in it because it's a way of showing how animals are valuable. If an animal can be the copyright holder of a photograph, then it's quite hard to do terrible things to animals, right? If you say it's like a clock, well, then no problem. I can have a live vivisection and find out what I want to find out. If it's more like a child, then we start to get very uncomfortable with the kinds of things that we do to animals. And so it seems like understanding its agency, its capacity for making art, is going to have a big effect on how we treat it.
Right. And so in someone who's sort of doing a lot of this work is David Bulchitz and Amy Wilson from the Animal Law Reform. And this is kind of exactly the critique they have of our law, because the way that, as far as I understand, Roman Dutch law works, animals don't hold really any rights. They're not considered legal persons. And this creates a problem, well, at the moment it does create a problem for people who like to abuse animals, but at the moment we start to extend certain capacities to animals and we take seriously advanced cognitive capacities that they obviously exhibit. That's going to challenge the law as well. It's going to challenge the legal question of what makes something is a legal subject. Is that the right word, right? The subject of a law. And in America, you've got Stephen Wise, who passed away, but he created an organization that's actually arguing for the rights of animals, but a very specific right. So he's arguing for the right of habeas corpus. Is that the right way to say it, right? It's the right not to be held or not be imprisoned against your will, right? And so what he does is he went and he's had all of these court cases. They've all been unsuccessful. But the basic part is that he's been fighting for the right of these animals not to be held imprisoned. And so coming back to this idea of labor and labor being exploited, this was always my worry. But obviously something like the elephant, that's quite an obvious case that we worry about that. But even something like this, so this is a South African artist who I learned passed away in March, called Picasso, as in pig Casso, right? She's a pig, and she painted all of these amazing drawings. This is also one of her works. And I mean, the question I always have is there exploitation? Can she actually have the fruit of her labor? So, okay, some of these paintings sell for 70,000 Rand and sometimes even more. And what happens to that pig? That pig can't exactly, it's not like she can go to Woolworths and spend the money, right? So what happens in a case like this in terms of the law? Because she's not a holder of rights. She's not a holder of, you can't apply labor laws to her. But yet she seems to be working in some sense and there's a profit to be made. So that also brings us this idea of exploitation and labor.
So maybe one mistake made, and I say this as someone who really enjoys meat, maybe one mistake made is to lump all animals together. So it could be, suppose I were to grant that certain types of animals are capable of creating art. Maybe the elephant can, maybe the pig can, maybe the monkey can, but the cow can't, the sheep can't. Should we be lumping them all together? And if we don't lump them all together, then maybe this push towards animal rights doesn't go all the way down to all the animals we might want to eat. So you might get rights some of the way for some of the animals. So, okay, you can't eat chimps, but you could eat cows.
Because they can't make art.
Because they can't make art. Yeah. Well, that's the difficulty with this line of reasoning. So if you're going to say, well, look at these incredible animals with these amazing capacities, then it opens up for the meat eater to say, well, what about the animals that don't have those capacities?
So that reasoning also worries me, and I'll tell you why. And this is maybe a slightly meta-ethical discussion. If you look at around the 1970s, you have philosophers starting to deal quite seriously with the interests of animals. Obviously, Peter Singer in 1972, Animal Liberation, Tom Regan a few years later with the rights of animals. And so they really kind of started this idea of taking animals morally seriously, right? So not just dealing with them in an abstract way, but how are we supposed to treat them? Peter Singer is probably the most well-known person that's done that, and he relies on this idea of sentience. And he says, if we're not acknowledging the sentience of animals, the ability to feel pain and pleasure, we're committing something called speciesism. Right? So just like we have racism and sexism and ageism and ableism, we also have speciesism, where we're treating someone badly on the basis of being not part of our species. But my worry with that kind of line of reasoning, and let's call it the first wave of animal ethics, is that it still uses proximity to humans as a kind of ethical guide. Right? So the closer we are to humans, the higher the moral status is. But let's take something like an octopus. Right? I mean, they are phenomenal creatures, but I mean, they don't resemble humans in even the vaguest of ways, right? They're actually quite alien. And so if we're using proximity to humans to kind of guide our ethical decision-making, we could very easily go down a slippery slope where we're denying animals that really deserve moral status or moral consideration that, and obviously that can again be used with humans. Women aren't rational, women are far away from men, and you know, the rational man is our standard, then it becomes easy to deny people rights, and obviously that leads to certain kinds of oppression. So I'm worried about that line of reasoning.
Yeah, and actually if you were to take that line of reasoning a bit further, it would protect that particular pig that makes drawings, but not all pigs. I imagine that pig had to be trained for quite some time. Or, for example, when they talk about chimps being able to use sign language, they have, not just any chimp can use sign language. That chimp has to be trained for quite some time. If you just think about the variation within one species, so if you want a guide dog, not every dog is suitable to become a guide dog. You have to put a whole batch of dogs through training, and a very small proportion of them will get to stage 2, and a small proportion of those will get to stage 3. So, okay, you can't eat that dog, but you could eat the rest. So the problem with this line of reasoning of saying, well, anthropomorphic activities are what should protect animals, is that it's only those animals.
But then we must be careful to also not commit what Frans de Waal, he's an animal ethologist, or an ethologist, calls anthropodenialism, right? So we sometimes are so careful of anthropomorphizing, right, assigning human qualities to animals that we actually commit the opposite, which is anthropodenialism. It's quite clearly in pain. This animal is quite clearly in pain, but oh, we can't know, so let's just deny that it can feel this. And Frans de Waal kind of cautions us also against that line of reasoning, that we're so worried about committing anthropocentrism that we just deny very obvious things that we can just see, an animal being a pain, an animal having advanced capacities. And so I wonder if this debate doesn't kind of fit into that, right? Why are we so desperate to distinguish ourselves from animals that we're having trouble kind of saying that that's art, or that it's maybe good art?
So there is a long line in moral philosophy that when you're trying to work out whether something is morally significant, you look at its particular capacities. So as you say, rationality seems like one of those things that's valuable. So beings that have rationality, we think it's a check in favor of allocating them rights and responsibilities. You know, we think if you're rational, you're accountable for your decisions. So a child, for example, could kill someone. You put a knife in their hand and they kill their sibling. But we say you're not accountable for it because you know what you were doing. And we might think that about animals as well, that they are moral patients, but not moral agents. That a lion will go out and kill without any awareness of it doing anything wrong. But that's an animal which is unable to protect itself. We might think we have an obligation to it, like we do to a child, to look after it. And you're right that the way that the debate goes is we say, well, we think that human beings deserve rights. That's how we practically operate, and we find it repugnant when certain groups are denied their rights, even in instances where that particular being doesn't have the capacities. So a lot of people are going to think that if you've got a child that's born without certain cognitive capacities, that it's still wrong to kill that child, that it has a right because it's part of the species of being human. And so you could take from that, well, anything that's not part of the species of human is fair game, and practically that's what we do, right? We eat animals on a regular basis. We install them in galleries and have them as objects that we can enjoy. So that might be the line that you take. You just go, well, you're different from me, so I can do what I want to you. Or you start to say, well, maybe we should do an enlarging of the moral rights in one area. So these animals have the capacity. These animals are exercising the capacity. So there's the dog that's actually the guide dog. And there's two ways of viewing that. The one is you're valuable because of your use to the blind. And so it's like this glass isn't useful, but if it's mine, then you better not smash it because I have a relationship to it. Or no, it's valuable in and of itself. And that's why you shouldn't be doing bad things to it. But the guide dogs that didn't make it to round 3, well, we can do what we like to them because they're not valuable. Or we say they're part of a class. They have that capacity.
And the law actually reflects this intuition, right? So if you look legally, at least in South Africa, if let's say I have a bunny as a pet and Mark lives next door to me and he has a bunny farm where he farms bunnies, rabbits for meat, we have different legal obligations towards our animals. By virtue of that animal being my pet, certain laws apply to my relationship with that animal. So I can't just skin it and sell it, right? I could be accused of animal cruelty. But Mark, who lives right next door to me, he's totally fine. The law allows him to do that because he's being governed by different kind of laws. But there seems to be, there seems to be an intuition there that doesn't seem right, And then also this issue of capacity, right? So some of the animal rights and what has been called the second wave of animal rights or the second wave of animal ethics has proposed not looking at capacities necessarily, but something like flourishing. Right? So instead of saying, can this animal feel pain or pleasure, we ask, well, can it flourish? Right? And the moment you switch the conversation around to flourishing, that conversation looks very different, right? Because now it's not proximity to human capacity that grounds kind of moral status and moral consideration. It's rather this, well, an octopus can flourish, a cockroach can flourish, a sheep can flourish. All of these animals can flourish regardless of how close they are to our capacities as humans. And so that's a way, I think, to kind of reframe at least the moral decision. Coming back to something like this, is the animal being forced to do it? Can they flourish as an animal artist, right? And I think we can imagine that if that animal is being forced to do it and the elephant's being hit every time it made a bad elephant drawing, that would immediately kind of say, well, this isn't a flourishing animal. But if this animal really enjoys, and I'm going to go take you to this chimp called Congo. So Congo was around in the 1950s, one of the first sort of chimpanzee artists. And what was interesting about this is he seemed to have an idea of when the painting was finished, right? So at some point he would just lose interest. And it's not like he would lose interest in painting as an activity. He would lose interest in that particular painting. And so until you gave him a new piece of paper, he wouldn't carry on painting. It's like he had this idea that this was finished. Similarly, if he was still busy and you took the paintbrush away from him, he would get really angry and start throwing a tantrum. No, this isn't done yet, right? So again, I think it kind of brings us back to this idea of what makes art. And again, we're back at this, how do we define art? If I just say, well, art's a human endeavor, by that definition, none of these animals are artists. But I don't know if I want to commit to that definition. There seems to be things that challenge that.
So let's talk about animal flourishing. Okay, so when you mentioned flourishing, I thought, okay, I can understand a chimp flourishing. I can understand an elephant flourishing maybe, but a dung beetle I'd struggle, and a cockroach I'd struggle. So I'm not sure how a cockroach flourishes. To be honest, I'm not sure how a human flourishes. So it seems like it's a very nebulous idea. If I understand correctly, are you saying that this new wave of animal rights activists are arguing that insofar as a creature is capable of flourishing, it should have certain rights? We should not be able to treat it in bad ways.
I haven't read anything that grounds rights in flourishing yet, but at least moral consideration, or a different kind of moral consideration, right? So I think what we're starting to realize is simply grounding moral consideration, and even then, obviously by extension, things like rights, legal rights, simply in approximation to human capacities is problematic. So I haven't read anything that will quite go to legal rights because of flourishing. I haven't quite seen that argument. But I have seen people arguing that the first wave of animal ethics kind of reduces our ethical, let's say, ruler to a very specific kind of ruler. And we should maybe think more about things like capacity-specific flourishing, right? So, okay, a cockroach might flourish if I'm not trying to kill it, right? It might flourish if I leave food out at night. Whether that means I shouldn't kill the cockroach or not, I don't know.
Are you saying something like a certain animal's life can go better or worse?
Yes.
Okay, and so insofar as an animal's life can go better or worse, you have an obligation not to make it go worse. Something like that, yeah?
Yeah.
I don't know how a cockroach's life goes well or badly other than it's well-fed and breeds. Like, I don't understand. That seems to be the extent of a good cockroach life.
Pretty much. So does that entail our moral obligation is not to kill cockroaches?
Surely not, right?
I mean, I think there's a line where you say once you start to have a principle for when you have moral consideration on the scales, you want to be able to test our intuitions. And so we think there's lots of things that could flourish. So the algae in my pool can flourish, the mold in my ceiling can flourish in the sense of expanding. It's in the interests of the mold for me not to use mold removal on it or not to put chlorine in my pool. It itself cannot hold an interest. It doesn't care one way or the other, but its flourishing will be impeded through me using the weed killer or whatever else it is. And so if we go down that track, it starts to really curtail what we can do and the kinds of things we should consider. Interestingly enough, so Peter Singer is regarded as, without a doubt, one of the most influential philosophers in the world because of his views on animal rights, and one of the most infamous philosophers in the world because of his views on human beings. So we've had him on the show recently. He is, without a doubt, a phenomenal mind, and he often struggles to speak at certain universities because he gets picketed. Because he says, let's look at the other side of the equation. So if what we think matters is capacity to experience pain and pleasure, well, then we don't treat animals in a certain way. But what about those human beings who lack that capacity? Or what happens when we have a choice between the two? And so his infamous example is this. He says, there are certain babies that are born with a thing called spina bifida. So basically, they will be born, and if you don't interfere, they will probably live for about a year, and their lives will be full of pain. So what the doctors did, this is about in the 70s, about 50 years ago, is that they would withdraw all support. So you would let the child starve, and then it would die. He says, this seems very cruel. You're inflicting pain on a child. Why not actively intervene and just euthanize the child? Bring about the end of its suffering. It's going to die one way or the other, so that's what you ought to do. And so Peter Singer has been accused of having a eugenics project against the disabled. But there is a sense in which we might think, are we evaluating beings in terms of classes? So we say, well, what is the general capacity of this group? Or do we go down Jason's line and say, no, what does this thing do? Is this one of those Labradors worth saving because it's a special Labrador? Like, look, we can eat pigs, but not this pig. This pig's an artist. Come on, you don't put him in the bacon oven.
Right, and I'll even one-up you on one of Peter Singer's writings. So I wrote a paper a while ago about animals in art and the use of animals in art, and there's, I can't remember the guy's name. I want to say something like, he was some Russian guy, and he basically conducted performance art with his dog of quite an intimate nature, right? So intuitively, this was in a gallery, this was like, so this is an artwork by at least an institutional definition. By any other definition, this is bestiality, right? And then I was, as what sometimes happens when you're a philosopher, you end up reading really strange things that you did not think you were going to end up reading when you started writing the paper. And Peter Singer has a paper on bestiality, and basically saying, well, as long as the animal's not suffering, and it seems like the animals often don't suffer, in fact, that they quite enjoy it, then there's no problem. So the opposite also becomes true. It's not just how we apply that kind of reasoning to humans, but even animals, and what we then allow. If we're simply looking at pain and pleasure, that becomes a difficult thing, because then we can justify something like bestiality as long as the animal seems quite keen, right? And I had a real struggle with that. Like, my intuition was like, this is not okay. But I found it really difficult to kind of objectively argue against that because there's no pain involved. The animal seems to be treated well. The animal actually seems to quite enjoy it. And in that case, it was also considered an artwork. If it happened anywhere else, it would be considered bestiality. And so that kind of even takes Peter Singer's, and I didn't quite know how to go against that kind of argument, which is why I think perhaps we need to look at different kind of capacities or at least different ethical guidelines than simple pleasure or pain, the ability to feel pleasure, because you might head down a hedonistic kind of pathway where we just do what's nice, and that might not be good for any species.
I mean, Singer in that infamous paper says it might be wrong to have sex with the animal, but what's worse for the animal, to have non-consensual sex or to be murdered, often in a very painful way? He thinks, well, we all endorse eating meat, so there's a sort of strange intuition going on. And I think most people think that bestiality is one of the worst things that you can do. One move that can be made is to say it's not that you're wronging the animal, it's that you're wronging yourself, that you have this duty to yourself to, treat yourself with some level of dignity, and so that's where the wrong-making goes on. It does seem with the animal, what role it has makes a difference. So there's the passive animal, the active animal. There's a very infamous case of someone who sat on the shoreline and would encourage dolphins to sort of like spend time with them. And dolphins are seen as these like very sentient creatures, and it's always unknown whether it is a sort of spoof piece or one of these, animal rights activists.
Which again brings us back to kind of considering the animal, right? And what the animal is doing, because and now we're heading into very treacherous territory, right? Only now. We're philosophers. It takes a while for us to get there. But if we're now starting to think about, again, thinking about the animal and thinking about something like agency, right? And if that's our guide, then, this chimp seems to have agency to create artworks, or at least what we would term in some sense art or artistic or creative. And should we then go back to something like that? But then again, that kind of brings us back to, if we apply this in other cases, we might be justifying really problematic behaviors with animals where they cannot consent, right? So at what level is consent perhaps important in something like animal activities?
Yes, I take it that really a central question here is how we determine rightness and wrongness. Mark leans towards a Kantian view, which basically involves dignity, and I lean towards a utilitarian view, which basically involves making sure that no one is harmed or no one suffers. Now, the question is, should we consider each individual in the case, which is what the utilitarian says, or should we consider, as Mark says, the class of being? So should we consider all chimps, all pigs? Is the pig the kind of thing that would be harmed by this action? And when you go down that route, which I think is what a lot of animal rights activists do, or at least animal welfare activists do, you arrive at some really bizarre outcomes when you consider doing the same thing with regard to humans. So if you were to say to someone, you need to be punished because your class of people have done something wrong, or you need to be rewarded because your class of people have done something right, that feels uncomfortable. So you should be punished because someone in your family murdered someone would be odd. You need to serve their jail sentence. That would be odd.
And this is sometimes the tension in philosophy between animal ethics and, let's say, something like environmental ethics, right? So often if you do animal ethics, you're looking at the specific animals, this pig painting, this painting. But if you do environmental ethics, you often speak at the species level, right? So now we're no longer considering this animal, we're considering all animals. And what I find is that it's actually very difficult to resolve that tension between kind of species interests. And some people would say, well, we spend all of this money trying to conserve certain species, right? The pangolin, the rhino. But, I mean, who is being harmed if the rhino goes out of existence? A species cannot be harmed. It's not the kind of thing that can be harmed. An individual can be harmed, but a species cannot be harmed. So if we simply kind of let rhinos die out, who is being harmed? Because that's the question in morality, is who's being harmed? A species cannot be harmed.
Yeah, and so if we decide that question in favor of individuals over species, so if we decide that an individual lion or an individual rhino is more important than rhino species or lion species, then it becomes particularly difficult to answer moral questions, artistic questions, any kind of questions, because we don't know what's in the mind of a particular animal. So we might do lots of studies on pigs generally and find out that pigs are capable of certain types of things, but we don't know any given pig, and that given pig can't communicate with us. So this question of species versus animals becomes really, really important when conserving animals, which is why it's okay if after this you want to go for dinner and have a burger.
Wow. No, but I think that's kind of exactly it. And what you were talking about earlier also is often with moral philosophy, and again, this is maybe a meta-ethical kind of point of view rather than an issue of animals and art specifically, is our ethical intuitions, our ethical principles often break down at the periphery, right? So we can talk about pain and pleasure until we get to bestiality, right? Then, okay, now, that starts being a bit more difficult. We can talk about reducing harm until it's about what I eat on my plate tonight, right? So this is often what ends up happening with a lot of the discussion around moral, like animal ethics and environmental ethics, is that it does start breaking down. Then what someone like African philosophers might want to say is that what's not important, it's not the utilitarian account and it's not the Kantian account that's important, but it's rather the idea of relationality, and relationality grounds moral rights. So the fact that Mark is my friend grounds my moral rights, but if you're just a stranger, I might have less moral kind of responsibility towards you or moral obligation towards you, because it's about the relationship, and the relationship ends up grounding moral rights. And we see this in a philosophy like Ubuntu, right? That's essentially what Ubuntu is. It's about being a human between other humans and acknowledging humanity, but it also allows to some extent for me to treat those closer to me with more moral consideration than those further away from me. So it might be that something like Ubuntu provides us with a different ethical framework to consider our relationships towards animals, and perhaps animals that have certain capacities.
So one of the great joys of running our Brand of Art show is that we get to hear back from our audience, but we only get to hear back from them on YouTube comments or comments on Spotify. And so one of the special things about having all of you here tonight is that we get to hear from you live. So I'm going to hand over the mic, and I look forward to hearing some of your thoughts.
So if anyone has any questions for Yolandi or any of us, or comments or objections, go ahead.
Hi, my name is David. Thanks very much, gentlemen. So it seems that in some ways we're conflating the discussion around do animals have rights, which I think is a debate, versus do they actually have the proper agency or capacity to create art. And, you know, I was very fortunate recently to visit the Vatican, and I went and saw the Sistine Chapel. And I don't think that chimp over there could paint what Michelangelo did all those hundreds of years ago. And yeah, so I think, I mean, ultimately it does boil down to the question of what is art, and how do you define it. But you mentioned birds, and yeah, you know, I think we've all heard parrots that are mimicking the sounds that humans make, but you wouldn't say that they are talking or communicating even in that sense. But when birds chirp at one another, I think it's reasonable to assume that they are communicating. So, I mean, is what these animals, is what they're doing, is that just some kind of form of mimicry? Or is there actually some kind of agency there? I'm not sure.
And I think that's a really interesting question, because if you look at a lot of early art, I mean, what is that if not mimicry? I mean, the David is just mimicking a certain kind of human body. The Dutch realists, right, they were really concerned with being able to paint a glass and a tin and their fruit, and they had all these things that they really had to master painting. But is that not just, like you were saying earlier, advanced kind of printers, really? And so what makes art art? So if we're just thinking, well, it's mimicry, if we say, well, all these animals are doing is mere mimicry, then we might have to say the same thing about someone like Michelangelo's David or the Dutch realists. It becomes trickier when we change our definition of art and we see the kind of conceptual art movement coming in, because there seems to actually be a lot more agency rather than mimicry. But I'm no art historian, so let me not commit to that position. There was a hand here. Blue, yeah, and then one at the back.
Hi, good evening. My name is Moshe, and something that struck me about this entire discussion is that there was no discussion on meaning. There's a lot of discussion on value of art. There's a lot of discussion on how, as animals, we living without agency. I mean, if you think about the animal kingdom, without the humans' involvement, the animals will just flourish in nature because that's the harmonious nature of animals living and existing. But as humans, we place value to things. And when I think of memory, memory is a huge trigger for modes of expression. If you look at the elephant, and I was very struck by that image of the elephant, drawing a picture of a baby elephant. Who's to say that that elephant didn't draw from its own memory to create this incredible piece of work, because it was just something that needed to be expressed. We as humans place value on art dependent on those institutions. We think about, Michelangelo. He was commissioned to do this, to do the Michelangelo. It was a commissioned thing. But I mean, I'm sure he would doodle his own things also, And there's also no question of what I love Mozart, I love Amadeus, but the idea of art being a godly virtue, something that comes from a place that exists somewhere else in the mind. And we talk about a lot of the isms that exist in the mind. But if I look around this place here, this entire space comes from the mind of Roger Bellin. This is like, we're looking into his unconscious. So meaning is derived from art. And, who's to say what it is, because it comes from such a personal place. So the question is who is an artist? Personally, I believe everyone is an artist. The way that you design your dinner table, the way that you brush your hair in the morning, it comes from a creative mode of expression that gives you meaning. And that to me is what art is. And I think that all animals have that too. When I see my cats at night find a way to cuddle each other on the blanket, fluffing up the pillows, that's something that they've created together. And yeah, animals are incredible. They can do that, So it's not really a question, it's just an insight, comment. So thank you.
Well, something to think about is, bring up that image of the elephant again. I was saying to Yolandi before we started recording that it seems really important to know whether the elephant was expressing self-awareness there or not. And it seems like we can imagine two cases. So the one is that you put a paintbrush in the elephant's hand, or the elephant's trunk, and the elephant suddenly draws an elephant. And we think, wow, this is either self-awareness or awareness of other elephants around me. That's incredible. That has significant implications. Second possibility is that this elephant, through laborious training and maybe beating every time the elephant did it wrong or did it in another way, was trained to draw this image, right? Those would, as you say, have two very different senses of meaning. The meaning of the artwork and the meaning that the elephant could derive from the artwork. And it seems like which one of those cases is reality is going to, which one is actually producing this image, is going to really change how we assess what's going on here.
But can the same argument not be made for the art graduate, right? That went through 3 or 4 years here at FADA, and the lecturer is saying, no, this is the wrong kind of art to make, right? So can a similar argument not be made for even human artists?
I think in both cases we'd have the same intuition. So in the case of the art student who goes through art school and is pushed into a certain manner of expression, we would say that's not as artistic as if that art student generated something, maybe despite being told to do differently.
But then our definition of art becomes a continuum and not a black and white, right? So it's not, is it art, yes or no? Is it more art or less art, right? Which, I don't know. There was a hand in the back. There was one there, one there, one there.
Thank you. Thanks very much, guys. My name is Andrew. And I think we're heading now in the direction that I was just going to ask about, is the word I don't believe that's been used is talent yet. And to me, and it sort of came up also in this question around the Sistine Chapel, is that, and even right earlier on in the talk, someone mentioned the animal being forced almost by punishment to do the art. And I went through school, and I was in school in the 70s, and we had an art teacher, and we were caned. And I did art, and I'm not an artist. And I went through the motions, and I've had a paintbrush in my hand, and I've had a pencil in my hand, but my art is crap. So to me, there is an element of talent, and there is an element of professionalism. I disagree with this gentleman. I don't believe everyone's an artist. I think most people are terrible. And I think we have to acknowledge what a good artist is or a great artist is. And we can't say, oh, you're all artists or you're all mathematicians. You get people who are horrific mathematicians, and you get people who are very good. And I think you get great artists. So I think these animals are showing basic skills of being able to hold a paintbrush. I can hold a paintbrush. But if we're going to measure on that level, we should both be eaten. So I'm just saying that I do think when we're asking, are animals artists, you should also say, are they good artists, or are they able to physically put paint to paper, which are two different things. And yes, there are some basic forms there, but I agree, it's not Michelangelo.
So I think you've summarized a conversation my husband and I have had numerous times. He's an artist, he's a sculptor. And when we started dating a good 10 years ago, 11 years ago, he would show me these artworks, and I'd be like, well, that's not art. And he'd be like, but it is. I'm like, but a kid could do that. And he's like, yes, but someone did it, and someone called it art, and someone said to put it in a gallery, and that's why it's art, right? And if we go back to something like, I thought this was quite an interesting artwork, because I think it's horrendously ugly, this one, but it sold for like $10 million, right? And I kind of feel like I chose the wrong career. I can just put some splotches on a thing and just yeah. But I mean, this is kind of the issues where we're getting back to the definition of art. What is art? Who gets to call it art? Is it just the fact that this sold for 10 million that makes it an artwork? Or, I mean, is it good art? Is it bad art? How do we judge that? I don't know.
So one way you could cash out the talent question is to ask talents in relation to what? So often people say, my child is a really talented artist. You say, in comparison to Roger Ballin, no, your child's a terrible artist. Louis C.K. is fond of talking about how bad his kids are at making art. But we fawn over them, we go, oh, you're amazing because the other kids are so much worse. And so you might think that elephant is a good artist in relation to all the elephants, but not in relation to us. And so you could see a certain kind of value. You could have thresholds for what counts as art. So you could say it has to be at a certain level of goodness, and then your art. Or you have a low threshold, anything's art, but then what we really care about is whether it's good or bad. And then the good or badness is either some objective feature or in relation to other makers or what else is around.
I also think, and perhaps this is just being married to an artist and actually getting behind the creative process. So I see him going into his studio every day and doing his work. That we have this idea that the artist is someone, Michelangelo stood in front of a block of granite and he was just started chopping away, and then, David emerged, or the artist just stands in front of the canvas and kind of just makes marks, and eventually there's this artwork. And I think that's a naive view of what art is, right? I mean, at least from my experience, artists actually spend a lot of time making maquettes. They spend a lot of time solving the problems on smaller levels. They spend a lot of time, it's not just talent. Talent only takes you that far. It's eventual skill, right? Eventually you need to know that this material with this is going to do this, the oil paint's going to do this. So when my husband really abhors when people tell him he's talented, he's like, I'm not talented. I've worked really hard to be able to do what I have. I've honed that skill over, he's 51 now, he's honed that skill over the better part of his life, right? And so I think also talent might be overemphasized in a lot of times, and that people might have this idea that it's just inspiration that hits, and Michelangelo just stood in front of the block of granite and Michelangelo just appeared a few days later, which I think is maybe a naive view of art.
So here's a question. It might be an unfair question because I know you haven't worked with these animals that are creating this art, but do they display the same progression as human artists? So does the monkey get better and better over time? And if it doesn't, and I'm assuming it doesn't, that might count against the monkey as an artist.
Right, because it's not exhibiting a certain skill. And I mean, from what I saw, some of these, I mean, this is chimpanzee, human, chimpanzee, chimpanzee. This is actually chimpanzee using its tongue. I don't know, it used its tongue to paint this. So chimpanzee, and I mean, I don't know how to judge if that's getting better or worse. It's just different, right? And so perhaps if there's an art critic here, someone can tell us whether it's getting better or worse. But I mean, I don't know. Is it getting more refined? I don't know. Right? And that's a good question. Is the skill getting more advanced? Or should that even be a criteria? Is it, because then we go back to the Dutch realists just being really good printers of just replicating reality very carefully.
I think the actual ghost in the machine here is the question, which we haven't actually settled, of what constitutes art. And I think it's a fallacy to try and look at the intention of the artist, because we cannot possibly access that. I mean, we can access what artists who are currently living say about their intentions, but artists who are no longer currently living, we can't access their intentions, and animals we can't anyway. So, I mean, that's just a dead end. But maybe we can look at the reception of the art and how it's been categorized by people who think. And I mean, it's then that then leads us to maybe the non sequitur of the whole art establishment process. So who decides what is art, what gets exhibited in galleries, what gets sold, what gets categorized as, I mean, looking at the picture on the screen, as a potentially dark and yet a dark picture, but yet containing seeds of redemption, and as well as some, some dark lines which indicate a possible impulse towards dissolution or something like that, whatever the rubbish is that the art establishment spouts. So, I mean, it also has to do with how we receive it and how we see it and how we respond to it. And that's, I'm sorry, but that tends to be very subjective.
Absolutely. I think thinking also about the skill thing, my husband showed me this artwork by, I think it's de Kooning. No, it's the Rays de Kooning, right? So some artist, I've now forgotten the name, took a de Kooning artwork, a sketch. Okay? Yes, and just erased it, right? I mean, there's no skill. The 1-year-old can erase something. But what about that? So the skill argument falls flat in cases like that, right? Where artworks and the urinal, which seems to not really need much skill or talent at all. It's just someone kind of seeing something and calling it something and putting it in a specific room. And then it gets the kind of recognition from the art fraternity. But that again brings me back to these ideas of like, who's in power, right? Who has the say? And why is the guy on the side of the road in Hoedspruit, someone mentioned Hoedspruit earlier, selling crafts that are amazing, being viewed as a crafter, not an artist? Is it just because he's on the side of the road and not in a venue like this? So I think there's a lot of power at play in a discussion like this. Who gets to decide? Who's the ones who make the rules? And that's where we have to look, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who value these things and sell them in galleries and those kinds of things. So it becomes a bit of a political question as well.
So we could draw a distinction between a technical skill and a conceptual skill. So if you're the first person who thought, I'm going to take the de Kooning and I'm going to transform it into a new work of art through erasure, that's not the kind of thing that an elephant can do. That's not the kind of thing that many artists throughout history had thought they could do. It required a certain kind of conceptual ingenuity, and you might say that's the brilliance that we're admiring. That when we think about the fountain, I mean, the fountain is a really fun piece, because on the one hand, you've got an ambiguity: is this a work of art? You've got this proclaimed urinal that Duchamp puts in the gallery. He signs Armat, he inverts it. Is it a joke? Is that the intention, or is it to create a work of art? He then makes a series of replicas after the thing is recognized as a work of art. Those are the ones that are in the galleries. You saw one in Italy, I saw one in London. There's all the intentionality, right? There's all the understanding of how important this work is. And people are like, wow, I have an original fountain, sort of, it's a copy. Are those copies non-arts? Are they just replicas of the real art? Are they just replicas of the joke? But at least the conceptual work is something that we think is admirable.
You're assuming a joke can't be art, though. I think there was a question.
Just before you ask, I just want to say I totally understand that philosophy is very frustrating. You said we haven't settled, on the account of art. If we did manage to do that, we would be the first. Philosophers have been debating this for quite some time, and you'll notice we haven't answered the question whether animals can be artists. We've just raised a lot of other questions.
And this is what I say to my students. We live in the questions. We don't live in the answers.
Exactly. The answers are interesting to us, and we consider the answers, but the wisdom in philosophy is really in ruling out answers. So when we ask a question, there's a number of answers that are given to that question, and then we give objections to each of those answers. And we say, okay, so some of these objections are conclusive objections. These objections dismiss these possible answers as plausible. We no longer think those could be answers. That leaves us with a more limited set with challenges that have to be overcome. And then philosophers will work on those challenges. So, yeah, I totally sympathize with your frustration.
Here's another question. So it relates to the elephant image. Do you know of any incidents where animals use mimesis? Because that might actually shed some light on this image.
Right. So mimesis as in?
As in animals mimicking actually what we use to mimic nature as humans. We use mimesis to mimic nature. Is there evidence of animals doing the same thing?
Well, the case that David brought up is the parrot, right? So there you have mimicry of language without the internal understanding of language. And so that's a good distinction. It seems to make a difference whether you're merely creating a replica of a thing or a thing itself.
So I'm not sure about specific instances, but what immediately came into my mind is a book by Stephen Vogel. And Stephen Vogel wrote this book, What Is It Like to Be a Mole, right? Based on What Is It Like to Be a Bat by Thomas Nagel. But this What Is It Like to Be a Mole basically argues that we have one of two options. Either we're part of nature, and so everything we create is natural, including buildings, shopping malls, that kind of thing. Or we have to commit to not being part of nature. And that seems a really difficult position to hold, right? And so I do this thing with my students where I send them out, my environmental philosophy students, and I say, okay, walk around campus for half an hour, take a picture of something that's natural, something that's unnatural, and something that's you're not sure what it is. And it's really interesting about what they bring back, because actually this thing is, like, your question almost assumes that there is something that animals, like mimicking nature as if we're not ourselves natural beings, right? So I would go down there and kind of maybe question your assumption there. But even that is an assumption that we're doing it consciously, right? How much of our behavior is actually unconscious behavior, right? I might look at my husband and think, oh, he's so wonderful. He's like, look at him, and he is actually quite wonderful. And I might look at him and think he's so wonderful, but actually, just his pheromones hit me at the right time in my life where my body was like, make a baby with that guy. I never did, but maybe I think I'm choosing this partner in life, but it's actually just pheromones that's interacting with each other. So again, I would go back to how much of what we're doing is actually conscious. I think a lot of what we do is actually quite unconscious.
Have a look at that pufferfish image.
Yes. We didn't talk about the pufferfish.
So this is the pufferfish generated image, and if you disturb it, the pufferfish will go and make another one, right?
But it'll fix it in the same way. It won't just make another one that's similar or whatever, it will fix it in exactly the same way. So different pufferfish have these different patterns, and so they seem to have this idea of like exactly what they want to make.
And that suggests it's sort of determined to create that piece.
Yeah, and is that consciousness? Because by a very rudimentary definition, that would be consciousness, right? So again, we're getting back to this like slippery slope of how do we define consciousness? How do we define intent? And again, this is where philosophers get really excited. It's exactly in these spaces that are so difficult to answer concretely that philosophy lives. There was a question here and then one there.
Good evening. Thank you so much for that entertaining conversation. I'd like to agree that humans are part of the animal kingdom, and what makes us different is that we discriminate to a higher level of degree, a higher degree of level. So when we look at this pufferfish, he'll come back and make it again, but we'll still be like, that's not straight enough. That can be straighter. Oh no, you're white, you're black. Oh no, you're a lady, you're a man. And then that causes us to have different aspects. So then we talk about what makes good art, what makes bad art, what makes art, really, what isn't art. And I think onto the lady's point of how do we define it? And I'd like to add that it's not just philosophy that hasn't defined the questions they ask. I mean, as physicists, we don't even know what an observation means. Right? And it's quite fun. You go to any physics convention, you ask them, hey, what's an observation? What's a measurement? Everybody loses their mind. We don't know what that is. And my question is to you all individually, what do you suppose, just in your own individual view, is good or bad or right and wrong? Thank you.
In terms of art?
No, just in general. In general.
So before I answer that question, which I think is an unanswerable question, my theory about physics is if you go big enough or small enough, it becomes philosophy, right? If you go to the really big levels, it becomes philosophy. If you go to the really micro, we don't know if it's strings or what it is. It becomes philosophy in the end, right? So that's my theory on physics, my very uninformed theory of physics, having not done science since like standard 8. But regarding this idea of what can be right and wrong, as someone who considers herself a moral philosopher, I actually think there's very few things that I will put my head on a block about. There's a few things. I think the harm thing is one thing. Discrimination is another that I will like put my head down and say that is just wrong, right? That is just morally wrong. But I think at the end, what we need to understand is a lot of these things are social convention. A lot of it is social constructs, and I think even something like art is a social construct, right? It is just something that has gender is a social construct, right? Politics is a social. A lot of these things that we are so committed to actually end up just being social constructs. I like Marx. I'm a secret Marxist, maybe not so secret Marxist. But Marx talks about commodity fetishism, right? Where we create these commodities and then we fetishize them as if we're not the ones who actually ended up creating them, right? We do the same thing with money, right? We cannot imagine a world with capitalism has ended. Yet capitalism is a human invention. And I think it might be something similar here where we're fetishizing this idea of art as if it was not humans who created art. We're fetishizing maybe some certain moral positions as if it's not a human construct. So at the end, I think I become quite hesitant to say anything about what's right and wrong. I have a few personal positions, but yeah, I don't know.
So I think Yolandi is probably in the minority of philosophers to not take a stance. Most philosophers will tell you they absolutely know what's right and wrong and what art is.
Those are bad philosophers.
So, yeah. So you're definitely looking at a bad philosopher here. So I'm quite certain that utilitarianism gives you the correct answer to what's right or wrong. And I'm skeptical about the existence of art. So I don't think art exists. And part of the reason why I don't think it exists is that all of these definitions of art fail so badly. So when something does exist, when a concept does represent something real in the world, we're able to very quickly resolve problems with that concept. With art, you get one question deep. You ask one difficult question and it falls apart. So I'm quite skeptical that it exists at all.
So I'm going to offer you an invitation instead of an answer, which is we've done, I think, roughly now about 220 episodes of Brain of Art, where we speak about some of the deep questions. So on what is art, what is beautiful, what is good, what should we do? We talk about a whole range of puzzling questions, and we do get some interesting answers. So if you want to know more, I'd say check us out on YouTube.
Spoken like a true capitalist.
Hi, just bear with me because I'm also thinking out loud. But I want to go straight back to the beginning of the conversation. We were talking about the functionality of those birds' creations, and it sort of relates to a lot of different things. The one is, are we defining art as something that isn't functional? Does it just serve a mind masturbation purpose, or can it also be functional? And that poses the question of, again, who defines what art is? And from a Western perspective, we've created this false thing called craft. We look at mostly African or any people of color's creations that are functional, that these skills have been passed down through generations, and we call it craft. How is that based in anything other than bias or discrimination, for example? And that's why I think I might agree that art doesn't necessarily exist. Art is creation. And that's why the elephant painted that thing, and it is art to me. I don't know if I completely agree with the gentleman who said the way you brush your hair or the way the cats curl up might be art, but I do agree that a little tune you might whistle that comes and pops into your head, that's art. It's accidental. Accidental things can also be creation. So if something comes into being and it was made by another being, that's something that was created. But that thing that art doesn't exist, being an artist and being in the industry is a very important question that you posed, and it sort of blew my whole perception of the entire conversation in a completely different direction as well. If art doesn't serve a function, then all those crafts are then crafts and not art. I don't really know how to finish.
No, but I think what you're
comment.
saying is your intuition is pointing you into the same direction as Deirdre's question here there about like who has the power to call something art. Your question about functionality is an important one. I believe we've got a fashion designer in the house, right? I mean, what are clothes if not functional, right? But yet we believe that's, if I go into Mr. Price and I buy something off the rack versus some couture dress, there's a difference there. And why is that different? Is it sheer skill? Is it because, I don't know, someone spent more time making it? And then again, that disparages this idea that there's an incredibly skillful craft person sitting in some, sweat factory somewhere creating these artworks. And so is it just context? Is it just that some rich guy or woman created that gown over there, and then some like underpaid laborer or maybe even not paid laborer created this other thing? And so what I think you're getting at is this actually the political question of art, right? Who gets to decide? Who gets to kind of put that label on something? When something is mass produced, does it cease being art? Is it uniqueness that makes something art? Is it just being one of a kind that makes something art? And so these things really, I think, go, and in philosophy we'll talk about ontology, right? So the being, right? What is the being of something? And this really goes back down to what is art? It takes us right back to that incredibly foundational question.
I just have one more thing to add, and I think it's interesting that we're even having this debate about animals when it's still a debate within our species about what makes art and which human makes the art. And that goes back to that conversation about the value of certain animals, like the guide dogs, for example. And that's all discriminatory. So how do we know that we are not actually just discriminating against the animals? You mentioned the speciesism, or whatever it is. How do we know that a couple 100,000 million years from now, those animals will not evolve to a place where they're sitting in this room and they're having a conversation about whether the microbes can make art or not?
And we go back to someone like Van Gogh, who sold, I think, one painting in his entire life, right? So by any institutional definition, he was a pretty shitty artist, right? But now we think of him as quite an amazing artist, right? So again, it kind of comes back to the institution who gets to define Yeah, there's another question here.
I think we're running out of time. I just want to end with one comment, is that just because we care deeply about something doesn't mean it's real. Yeah. So for atheists in the conversation, atheists in the house, you'll know that a lot of people care deeply about God, but that doesn't guarantee the existence of God. And even if you believe in God, you might not believe in someone else's God who they care very deeply about. So just because we might want animals to be artists, just because we might want art, by the way, I'm a writer, I'm an author, so I care very deeply about art in that sense, if writing is art, but I don't think it's real. So yeah, we're going to leave you with a lot of skepticism. Unfortunately, we have to end because we have very generous hosts, but we're running out of their time. But we'll be around for a few more minutes if you want to come up and chat with us. Thank you very much to Alan for organizing, and to the Inside Out Center for the Arts, and to Roger Ballin. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.